My name is James Wilson, and I've been an FBI agent for 12 years. But nothing in my career prepared me for what I discovered at Harrison's traveling carnival in the summer of 1995. It started with a simple missing persons case in Ohio. 3 kids had vanished without a trace over the past month. The only connection we could find was that they'd all visited this carnival before they disappeared. My boss thought it was nothing, just another dead end, but something in my gut told me to check it out. I remember pulling up to the carnival grounds that Thursday evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The Ferris wheel creaked as it turned, and carnival music drifted through the air. You know that music, the kind that's supposed to be cheerful but somehow feels off, like a song being played just a little too slow. I walked past the cotton candy stands and game booths, watching families enjoying their evening. Everything looked normal on the surface. Kids were laughing, carrying stuffed animals they'd won. Parents were taking pictures, but something felt wrong. Maybe it was the way some of the carnival workers stared at me a bit too long, or how the owner, Mr. Harrison, seemed to appear and disappear into the crowds like a shadow. What really caught my attention were the mirrors. They were everywhere, not just in the funhouse, but scattered throughout the carnival. Big, ornate ones with fancy golden frames that looked way too expensive for a traveling carnival. I noticed how Mr. Harrison kept wiping them clean, even though they didn't seem dirty. That first night, as I was about to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, was standing in front of one of those mirrors. But her reflection, it wasn't moving when she moved. And for a split second, I swear I saw another face in that mirror. The face of Tommy Jenkins, one of our missing kids. I knew right then that this wasn't going to be a normal investigation. I just didn't realize yet how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how many lives would be lost before I found the truth. I spent the next few days digging into Harrison's past. What I found gave me chills. His carnival had been traveling across the Midwest for the past 20 years, and everywhere it went, children disappeared. Not many, just 1 or 2 in each town. The local police never connected the dots because the carnival was long gone by the time anyone noticed the kids were missing. One night, I snuck into the carnival grounds after hours. The place was different in the dark, scarier somehow. All those happy rides and colorful stands turned into black shadows against the night sky. The only sound was the gentle clinking of those mirrors in the breeze. I found Harrison's office in an old trailer. Using my flashlight, I searched through his papers. In a locked drawer, I discovered something that made my stomach turn. A leather-bound book filled with names and dates. Tommy Jenkins' name was there, along with dozens of others. Next to each name was a strange symbol that looked like a twisted mirror. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. I quickly hid behind a filing cabinet. Through the window, I saw 3 carnival workers walking past, carrying something heavy wrapped in a blanket. They were heading toward the Hall of Mirrors. I followed them, keeping to the shadows. The Hall of Mirrors was the biggest attraction at the carnival, a maze-like building filled with those fancy mirrors. As I watched, the workers unlocked a hidden door at the back and disappeared inside. I crept closer and heard voices. One of them was Harrison's. "The mirror is ready," he said. "Bring me the new one." I peeked through a crack in the door. What I saw next still haunts me. They unwrapped the blanket, revealing a small boy, maybe 10 years old, sound asleep. Harrison stood in front of the largest mirror I'd ever seen, chanting words I couldn't understand. Then the mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and that's when I saw them, faces pressing against the glass from the other side. Children's faces, dozens of them, their eyes wide with fear. Among them was Tommy Jenkins, pounding silently on the glass. I wanted to burst in right then, but I knew I needed more evidence. I had to understand exactly what was happening if I wanted to save these kids. So I slipped away, my heart pounding, knowing I had to act fast before another child's soul joined those trapped behind the glass. Little did I know, Harrison had already spotted me. He was just waiting for the right moment to make his move. The next morning, I called my boss from a payphone outside the carnival. I needed backup, but how could I explain what I'd seen? Before I could figure it out, I noticed something strange. The carnival workers were taking down the smaller mirrors, moving them all to the hall of mirrors. I watched from behind a popcorn stand as Harrison directed them. He looked different in the daylight, older somehow, with deep wrinkles that hadn't been there yesterday. He kept checking his reflection in a small hand mirror, touching his face like something was wrong. That's when Sarah Miller, a cotton candy seller I'd been talking to, came running up to me. She was shaking. "Agent Wilson," she whispered, looking over her shoulder. "I need to tell you something about Mr. Harrison. I've worked here for 3 years, and I've seen things, terrible things." We went to a quiet spot behind the Ferris wheel. Sarah told me Harrison was over 100 years old. He used the mirrors to trap children's souls, stealing their youth to keep himself young. Every few weeks, he needed a new soul or he'd start aging again. "The mirrors are like batteries," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "They store the souls. That big mirror in the Hall of Mirrors? That's where he keeps them all. The other mirrors help draw children in. They're like traps." Just then, we heard screaming from the Hall of Mirrors. We ran toward the sound. Inside, a mother was looking frantically for her daughter. "She was right here," she kept saying. "She was just looking in that mirror." My heart sank. I knew where the little girl was. I ran to Harrison's trailer, grabbed the leather book, and started taking pictures with my camera. But when I turned around, Harrison was standing in the doorway. He looked ancient now, his skin gray and wrinkled like old paper. "You shouldn't have interfered, Agent Wilson," he wheezed. His eyes were milky white, and his teeth had turned yellow and sharp. "Now you'll have to join them." He raised his hand, and suddenly, all the mirrors in his trailer began to glow with an eerie blue light. I could hear children crying from inside them, and their small hands pressed against the glass, reaching out for help. I knew I had to act fast. The sun was setting, and I had a feeling that once night fell, Harrison would be at his strongest. But now I knew his weakness. He was getting older by the minute, and he was desperate for a new soul to stay young. I just had to figure out how to use that against him before anyone else disappeared. I ran from Harrison's trailer as fast as I could, clutching the book of names against my chest. Behind me, I heard him shouting orders to his workers. They were coming after me, all of them at once. The carnival had closed for the night, and the empty grounds felt like a maze. I ducked between game booths and rides, trying to stay in the shadows. I could hear footsteps all around me. The carnival workers moved like they weren't themselves anymore, more like puppets being pulled by strings. I needed to get to the Hall of Mirrors. If Sarah was right, that's where the main mirror was, the one holding all the souls. But how could I destroy it? Regular bullets might not work on something magical like that. Then I remembered something from the book. Each time Harrison trapped a soul, he used fire from special candles. Maybe that was it. Maybe fire was the key. I snuck into the maintenance shed and found what I needed: some rags, a bottle of cleaning alcohol, and matches. I made 3 makeshift torches, stuffing them in my jacket pockets. Getting to the Hall of Mirrors was the hard part. 20 or more carnival workers were searching for me, and Harrison was somewhere out there too. I could hear him coughing. He was getting older by the minute. I waited until 2 workers walked past, then made a run for it. But someone saw me. "There he is!" a voice shouted. I sprinted toward the Hall of Mirrors, workers chasing after me. Just before I reached the door, someone grabbed my jacket. I turned to see a worker's face, but his eyes were glassy, like he wasn't really there. I pushed him away and burst through the door. Inside, the Hall of Mirrors was like another world. Every mirror showed something different now. In one, I saw Tommy Jenkins playing with his toy cars. In another, the little girl who'd just disappeared was crying for her mom. They were all trapped, living their worst moments over and over. At the end of the hall stood the big mirror, taller than 2 men and wider than a car. The glass rippled like water, and I could see hundreds of faces behind it. All those lost children pressed against the glass like fish in a giant tank. Harrison's voice echoed through the hall. "You can't save them, Agent Wilson. They're mine now. They keep me alive." I pulled out my first torch, lit it, and got ready for the fight of my life. I knew that what I was about to do would either save all these children or trap me in the mirrors with them forever. Harrison stepped out of the shadows, looking like a walking skeleton now. His skin was pulled tight over his bones, and his eyes were deep black holes in his face. The carnival workers surrounded me, moving like zombies. "Give them back," I demanded, holding up my burning torch. Harrison laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You don't understand. Breaking the mirrors will kill them all. Their souls will be lost forever." But I'd read enough in his book to know he was lying. The children's souls weren't meant to be trapped like this. They needed to be set free. I threw the first torch at a smaller mirror. It shattered with a sound like breaking ice, and a bright light poured out. A little boy's spirit floated up and disappeared like smoke, finally free. The carnival workers charged at me. I wrestled with them, trying to keep hold of my other torches. Some of them were people I'd talked to just days ago. Now they were like empty shells. I realized Harrison had taken pieces of their souls too, to make them obey him. I managed to light the second torch and threw it at another mirror. More spirits escaped. Harrison screamed in rage, his body getting older by the second. But I wasn't ready for what happened next. The carnival workers started falling to the ground. Each time a mirror broke, they got weaker. Their bodies had been kept alive by the same magic that trapped the children. As the mirrors broke, that magic was disappearing. I reached the big mirror at the end of the hall. Up close, I could see all the faces clearly, years and years of trapped children. Harrison grabbed my arm, his touch cold as ice. "Please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll die without them." I looked him in his dark eyes. "You should have died a long time ago." I lit my last torch and threw it at the big mirror. The glass cracked like thunder, and light flooded the whole room. Hundreds of spirits poured out, flying up into the night sky like shooting stars. Harrison crumbled to dust right in front of me. Around the room, all 23 carnival workers lay still. Their bodies had been dead for years, kept moving only by Harrison's dark magic. When the police finally arrived, they found me sitting outside the Hall of Mirrors. All the mirrors were broken, and the carnival workers looked like they'd been dead for decades. The missing children were still gone, their bodies were never found, but I knew their souls were finally at peace. They shut down the carnival grounds and burned everything. But sometimes, on quiet nights, people say they see lights dancing in the sky above that empty field, like children playing among the stars, finally free to go home. I still work for the FBI, but I never took another carnival case, and to this day, I always cover the mirrors in my house before I go to sleep. Some things, once you've seen them, you can never unsee. My name is Richard Miller, and I wish I had never taken that case in Massachusetts. Every night, I still wake up in cold sweat, remembering the horrors I saw at the old Blackwood Mill. But I need to write this down, to warn others about what happened there, even though no one might believe me. It all started on a cold October morning in 1955. I was sitting at my desk in the FBI office in Boston, sipping my third cup of coffee, when Chief Watson dropped a thick file on my desk. "Miller, we've got a strange one," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. 6 people have vanished in a small town called Millbrook. 3 adults, 3 kids, all disappeared near that old textile mill on the edge of town. I picked up the file and started flipping through it. The pictures showed an enormous brick building, its windows broken and dark, ivy crawling up its walls like hungry fingers. Something about that building made my stomach turn, even in just a photograph. "Why us?" I asked. "Sounds like a local police matter." Watson shook his head. "Local cops are stumped. And," he hesitated, "some weird stuff has been happening. Lights in the abandoned building, strange noises, and one cop swears he saw a little girl walking through a solid wall. I almost laughed, but Watson's face was dead serious. I'd known him for 15 years, and he wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. "Pack your bags," he said. "You're heading to Millbrook tomorrow morning." I remember driving into Millbrook the next day. It was one of those small New England towns that time seemed to forget. As I passed the "Welcome to Millbrook" sign, the sky turned gray, like someone had pulled a curtain over the sun. And there it was, Blackwood Mill, standing tall and dark against the cloudy sky. I pulled over to get my first real look at it. The mill must have been beautiful once, but now it looked like a haunted house from a horror movie. 5 stories of red brick and broken windows, with a tall chimney that reminded me of a bony finger pointing at the sky. An old man walking his dog noticed me staring. "I wouldn't go near that place if I were you, mister," he called out. "Nothing but death in there now. Nothing but death." I should have listened to him. God help me, I should have listened. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would change my life forever. My first real look inside the mill came the next morning. The local police chief, a man named Frank Porter, met me at the entrance. He was a big guy with gray hair and hands that couldn't stop shaking. "Watch your step in there," he warned, shining his flashlight through the broken front door. "Floor's not too stable in some places." The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was like walking into a freezer, even though it was a warm fall day outside. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, and somewhere above us, pigeons fluttered in the rafters. The whole place smelled of rust and old wood. "Last week," Porter said quietly, "Tommy Jenkins, age 10, was playing here with his friends. They were just being kids, you know. But Tommy never came home. His friends said he went up to the 3rd floor to explore. When they went to look for him, he was just gone." I wrote in my notebook while Porter talked. 5 more people had vanished after Tommy. Sarah Chen, a high school teacher, the Wilson twins, both aged 8, Bob Murray, the local handyman, and Mary Peterson, a nurse at the town clinic. All of them had disappeared without a trace. As we climbed the creaky stairs to the 2nd floor, Porter's flashlight caught something strange on the wall. It looked like scratch marks, but they went sideways, as if someone had been dragged through the air. "Chief," I called out, running my fingers over the marks. "How old are these?" Before he could answer, we heard it, a child's laugh coming from somewhere above us. Porter's face went white. "That's impossible," he whispered. "We cleared every floor this morning." We rushed up to the 3rd floor, our flashlights dancing across empty rooms filled with broken machinery. The laughter had stopped, but now there was something else, a soft crying sound, like a child in pain. "Hello?" I called out. "This is the FBI. If anyone's there, we're here to help." The crying stopped instantly. And then we saw it, a small footprint in the dust, appearing right before our eyes, as if an invisible child was walking across the floor. Another print appeared, then another. Porter grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here, now." But I couldn't move, because right then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints weren't walking away from us. They were coming toward us. Porter and I ran. We didn't stop until we were outside in the sunlight, both of us breathing hard. Looking back at the mill, I saw something in a 4th floor window, just for a second. A face, white as chalk, with dark empty eyes. When I looked at my notebook later, I found something I hadn't written. In shaky, childish handwriting, someone had scrawled, "Help us, he won't let us leave." I knew right then that this wasn't going to be a normal investigation. And I was right. It was about to get much, much worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footprints and that face in the window. So I did what FBI agents do best. I started digging into the mill's history at the local library. Mrs. Baker, the town librarian, knew exactly what I needed. She brought me stacks of old newspapers and whispered, "You should read about Edward Blackwood. He owned the mill back in the 1920s. The newspapers told a horrible story. 30 years ago, 12 workers, including 3 children, died in a fire at the mill. But something wasn't right about the story. According to the papers, the doors had been locked from the outside, and Edward Blackwood had collected a huge insurance payment right after. Just as I was reading this, my phone rang. It was Porter, and he was breathing hard. "Miller, get to the mill now. We found something." When I got there, Porter and 2 officers were standing in the rain, looking sick. "4th floor," Porter said. "We were doing another search, and—" I followed them up the dark stairs. The beam of my flashlight caught something swaying in the shadows. My heart stopped. There were bodies hanging from the rafters. But they weren't hanging from ropes. They were floating in midair, like invisible hands were holding them up. I recognized Tommy Jenkins and Sarah Chen among them. Their faces were peaceful, like they were sleeping. "Don't get too close," Porter warned. But I had to look. As I stepped forward, the temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. And then I heard it, a deep, angry voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "They're mine now," it growled, "just like the others were mine." The bodies suddenly dropped to the floor. We rushed to check them, but they were ice cold. They'd been dead for days. As we looked around for clues, I noticed something carved into one of the wooden beams. They burned, so they must burn. That's when it hit me. These victims hadn't been chosen randomly. Tommy Jenkins was the great-grandson of a mill worker who died in the fire. Sarah Chen had been researching the mill's history for a school project. Each victim had a connection to those who died in 1920s. But the real shock came when I checked the dates. The first disappearance happened exactly 30 years after the original fire. Edward Blackwood had died in prison just 1 month before. "Porter," I said, my voice shaking, "I don't think Blackwood ever left the mill. And I don't think he's finished." Just then, every door in the building slammed shut at once. A child's scream echoed through the halls. And down at the end of the room we saw him, a tall figure in an old-fashioned suit, his face hidden in shadow. When he stepped into the light, I saw that his skin was burned black, and his eyes glowed like hot coals. He pointed at us with a skeletal finger and smiled. "Welcome to my mill," Edward Blackwood said. "We've been waiting for you." Everything happened fast after that. Porter fired his gun at Blackwood's ghost, but the bullets went right through him. The ghost laughed, a horrible sound like breaking glass, and suddenly Porter was thrown across the room like a rag doll. "Run!" I yelled to the other officers. As they dragged Porter away, I did something either very brave or very stupid. I ran deeper into the mill. I had a theory. Ghosts usually haunt places for a reason, and those words carved in the beam, "They burned, so they must burn," made me think there was more to the story. I needed to find where it all started. The basement. That's where the fire began 30 years ago. I found the stairs behind an old metal door. As I went down, each step creaked under my feet. My flashlight showed old bloodstains on the walls. At the bottom, I found another door with strange symbols carved into it. The basement was one huge room filled with old machinery. But in the center was something that didn't belong, a circle drawn on the floor with weird writing around it. Inside the circle were old photographs of the workers who died, arranged in a pattern. And in the middle was a book, its cover made of what looked like human skin. "Now you see," Blackwood's voice came from behind me, "they wouldn't give me what I wanted, power, eternal life, so I made a deal with something darker." I spun around. He was floating near the ceiling, his burned face twisted in an ugly smile. "You killed those workers," I said. "You locked them in and started the fire as part of some evil ritual." "Smart boy," he laughed. "Their deaths made me stronger. But it wasn't enough. I need more sacrifices, fresh ones, young ones. Their fear makes me stronger." The ghost children appeared around him. Tommy, the Wilson twins, all of them with sad, empty eyes. They were trapped here, just like the workers who died in the fire. "Let them go," I demanded. "Or what?" Blackwood sneered. "You'll shoot me? I'm already dead, you fool." But as he talked, I noticed something. The book in the circle, every time Blackwood moved, it glowed slightly. That's when I understood. The book was holding him here. It was the source of his power. I had matches in my pocket, and all around me were old wooden boxes and papers, dry as dust. Blackwood must have read my mind. His face changed from a smile to pure rage. "Don't you dare!" he roared, flying at me with his hands like claws. But I was already moving. I grabbed the book, flicked the match, and threw them both into a pile of old papers. The basement exploded into flames. The fire spread faster than I expected. Blackwood screamed, not in pain, but in anger. The ghost children started to glow with a bright, gentle light, different from Blackwood's dark shadows. "What have you done?" he shrieked. The flames were everywhere now, eating up the old wood and that evil book. His form started to flicker like a bad TV signal. I ran for the stairs, but Blackwood wasn't going to let me go easily. He appeared in front of me, his burned face now a mask of pure hatred. With one wave of his hand, he slammed me against the wall. "If I go," he snarled, "you're going with me." The smoke was getting thick. Through watery eyes, I saw the ghost children floating above the flames. But something was different now. They were smiling. As the book burned, their chains to this place were breaking. "Thank you," I heard Tommy's voice in my head. "But you need to get out now." I tried to move, but Blackwood's power held me tight against the wall. The fire was everywhere. Above me, I could hear the old mill groaning as the flames ate through the floors. Then I saw them, the spirits of the workers who died in the first fire. They came through the walls, dozens of them, surrounded by a warm, bright light. They moved toward Blackwood like a wave. "No," he screamed, "you can't. I own you. I own this place." The workers said nothing. They just reached out their glowing hands and grabbed him. Blackwood fought like a wild animal, but he couldn't break free. As the book turned to ashes in the fire, his power was fading. I fell to the floor, finally free of his hold. The whole basement was an ocean of flames now. The stairs, my only way out, were burning. "Go," the spirits of the workers called to me. "Run." But I knew I couldn't. The fire was too big, the smoke too thick, and somewhere above me I heard the mill's ancient beams starting to crack. I had a choice: try to save myself, or make sure Blackwood never hurt anyone again. I stayed. The workers and the children gathered around me as the mill groaned and cracked above us. They weren't scary anymore. They looked peaceful, ready to move on. Even as the flames got closer, I felt strangely calm. "It's okay," Tommy's ghost said, taking my hand. "You're with us now." The last thing I saw was Blackwood dissolving into nothing, screaming as his power finally broke. The book was ashes, the mill was falling, and the souls he had trapped were finally free, including mine. They found my body in the ruins of the mill 3 days later. The official report says I died trying to stop an arsonist. In a way, I guess that's true. The mill is gone now, just a burned-out shell, but no one has disappeared in Millbrook since that night. Sometimes, they say, on quiet evenings, you can see children playing in the empty lot where the mill once stood. They're laughing, happy, free. And if you look carefully, you might see a man in an FBI jacket watching over them, making sure they're safe, making sure nothing evil ever comes back to that place again. My name is Timothy Brooks, and I've been with the Coast Guard for 15 years. I've seen plenty of strange things out at sea, but nothing like what happened at Lighthouse Point back in 1961. Even now, decades later, I wake up some nights hearing those sounds, those terrible sounds from beneath the waves. It all started on a cold morning in March when my supervisor called me into his office. "Brooks," he said, tossing a file across his desk, "we've got a situation at the Point Lighthouse." 2 keepers gone missing in the past month. No signs of struggle, no bodies, nothing. Just vanished. I picked up the file and flipped through it. The lighthouse stood on a rocky peninsula about 30 miles south of Providence, Rhode Island. It was one of those old stone towers that had been watching over ships since before the Civil War. The pictures showed a lonely place, gray stones rising against grayer skies, waves crashing against the rocks below. "What about the last communication from the keepers?" I asked. "That's the weird part," my supervisor said, rubbing his chin. "The last keeper, James Murphy, sent a regular radio check 3 days ago. Said everything was fine. Next morning, the automated signal went dark. When we sent someone to check, the place was empty. Coffee still warm in the mug, logbook entries stopped mid-sentence. Something about this felt wrong. In all my years of service, lighthouse keepers didn't just disappear. They were a dedicated bunch, proud of their work. And 2 disappearances in the same month? At the same lighthouse? "There's more," my supervisor continued, his voice getting lower. "Local fishermen have been reporting strange things around those waters. Missing nets, boats getting damaged by something. A few of them swear they've heard singing at night, out where the water gets deep." I tried not to roll my eyes at that last part. Fishermen and their stories, I'd heard plenty over the years, but I had to admit, this case was different. "I want you to head out there today," he said. "Stay at the lighthouse, keep it running, and figure out what's happening to our people. Take whatever equipment you need." As I left his office, I didn't know it yet, but I was about to walk into the darkest assignment of my career. One that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about what lives in the deep waters off our coast. I arrived at Lighthouse Point just before sunset. The old tower looked even more unwelcoming up close, with its peeling white paint and rusty metal door. The March wind cut right through my heavy coat as I unlocked the entrance and stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. Usually, a lighthouse has sounds. The hum of equipment, the radio static, maybe even a clock ticking. But here, nothing but the wind outside and the soft splash of waves below. I climbed the spiral stairs to the keeper's quarters, my flashlight beam bouncing off the stone walls. Everything looked normal at first, too normal. There were dirty dishes in the sink, an open book on the table, and a half-written log entry dated March 15th. 2100 hours. Heard the sounds again. Getting closer now. Think I should check the lower storage room. That was it. No sign of a struggle, just like they said. But something caught my eye, wet footprints on the floor, leading nowhere. They weren't from boots or shoes, and they definitely weren't human. They looked more like... Well, I didn't want to think about what they looked like. That night, I met Billy Hansen, an old fisherman who brought supplies to the lighthouse twice a week. His weathered face got real serious when I asked about the missing keepers. "Something ain't right in these waters anymore," he said, looking out at the dark sea. "Last month my nets came up all torn to pieces. Then I started hearing things, singing, but not like any singing you've ever heard. It gets in your head, makes you want to go closer to the water." I noticed his hands shaking as he lit his pipe. But that ain't the worst part. 2 nights ago, I saw something in my boat's spotlight. Thought it was a swimmer at first, but no person could swim that deep, that fast, and no person has eyes that glow like that in the dark. I wrote everything down, trying to stay rational. But that night, alone in the lighthouse, I heard it too. A soft, strange melody drifting up from the rocks below. It was beautiful in a way that made your skin crawl, like it wasn't meant for human ears. I forced myself to look out the window. In the moonlight, I saw shapes moving in the water. They looked like people swimming, but their movements were all wrong. And when one of them turned to look up at the lighthouse, its eyes caught the light and shone like mirrors. That's when I knew the fishermen weren't crazy. Something was out there, watching the lighthouse, waiting, and somehow it was connected to the disappearance of the keepers. I spent the rest of that night checking every door and window, my hand never far from my gun, but deep down I knew regular locks wouldn't keep out whatever was living in these waters. I needed to find out what happened to the missing keepers, and fast, before I became the next one to vanish. The next morning, I started searching the lighthouse from top to bottom. I had to find out what the last keeper discovered in that lower storage room. The door was locked, but the key was on the ring I'd been given. The storage room was cold and damp, with a strong smell of seawater, even though we were above the tide line. My flashlight beam showed shelves of old equipment, boxes of records, and, in the corner, something that made my heart skip, a hidden door in the floor. It wasn't on any of the lighthouse blueprints. When I pulled it open, I found a small room below with a desk and stacks of notebooks. They belonged to Thomas Reed, the keeper who disappeared first. As I started reading, my hands got sweaty despite the cold. The notebooks told a horrible story. It started 3 months ago, when Reed heard the singing for the first time. He wrote about creatures that came up from the deep, things that looked almost human but weren't. They could speak, and they made him an offer. "They want sacrifices," he wrote. "They say they can sink any ship that passes the point, kill everyone aboard, unless I help them. 1 person every month, that's all they ask. I tell myself it's to save others, but I know it's wrong. God forgive me." Reed had been choosing victims, sailors from passing ships, drifters nobody would miss. He'd flashed the lighthouse signal wrong on stormy nights, making ships come too close to the rocks. When sailors came ashore for help, he'd drug their coffee, and I felt sick reading the rest. But last month, something changed. Reed wrote that the creatures were getting greedy, wanting more sacrifices. When he refused, they took him. The next keeper, Murphy, must have found these notebooks too. His last log entry made sense now. He was probably trying to stop them. While I was reading, I heard something that made my blood freeze, scratching sounds coming from the walls. Not mice or rats. This was the sound of something big dragging itself through the spaces between the walls. I grabbed the notebooks and ran upstairs, locking every door behind me. But when I got to the keeper's quarters, I saw something that told me locks wouldn't matter anymore. There, on the floor, was a trail of wet footprints leading from the window. They were fresh. Looking out the window, I saw dark shapes moving in the water below. More than before, much more. They knew I had found out their secret, and they weren't going to let me leave. That's when I heard the singing again. It was louder now, and despite how beautiful it sounded, I could hear the evil in it. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, trying to pull me toward the window, toward the water. I had to do something fast. These creatures had killed who knows how many people, and they weren't going to stop. But as I looked at those shapes circling in the dark water, I realized I was trapped in this lighthouse with them. And night was falling. I spent that night barricaded in the radio room, sending SOS signals and trying to call for help. But all I got was static. Later, I found out why. They had torn the underwater cables. No help was coming. At dawn, I heard shouts from outside. 3 fishermen had sailed too close to the point, and their boat was stuck on the rocks. I watched in horror as dark hands reached up from the water, grabbing the boat's sides. I had to do something. I ran down to the rocks, yelling at the fishermen to stay on their boat, but it was too late. As their boat started sinking, they jumped into the water. That's when I saw them, the creatures, up close for the first time. They looked almost human, but their skin was pale gray and their fingers were long, with webs between them. Their eyes were huge and black, like a shark's eyes, and their teeth. I'll never forget those teeth. The creatures dragged the fishermen down. Without thinking, I dove in after them. The water was freezing, but I had to try. I followed them into an underwater cave, thankful for my Coast Guard diving training. Inside the cave, there was an air pocket. I could hear the fishermen shouting for help further in. Swimming through tunnel after tunnel, I finally found them. They were trapped in a cave with a small airspace at the top, but they were alive. That's when I saw the true horror of what was happening at Lighthouse Point. The cave walls were lined with bones, hundreds of them. These creatures had been feeding here for years, maybe centuries. And in the deeper caves, I could see more of them gathering, watching us with those black eyes. "Keep quiet," I whispered to the fisherman. "I'm going to get you out of here." But the creatures had other plans. They started coming closer, moving through the water like shadows. Their singing filled the caves, making my head spin. I could feel it trying to take over my mind, just like it must have done to Reed. One of them spoke, its voice like water running over stones. "You'll join us now, all of you. We need to feed." I saw more shapes moving in the dark water around us, dozens of them, and I knew we wouldn't survive a direct fight. But as I looked around the cave, desperately searching for a way out, I noticed something floating on the water's surface. Oil. That's when I remembered the lighthouse's fuel storage. These caves must connect to it somehow, and I knew what I had to do, even though the price would be terrible. The creatures were closing in, time was running out, and I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I had my waterproof flashlight with me, one spark near that oil, and I knew what would happen. But the fishermen were in the deepest part of the cave. There wasn't enough time to get them out first. "Give us the light," one of the creatures said, reaching toward me with its long, gray fingers. "Join us in the deep." I looked at the fishermen, trapped against the cave wall, then at all those bones. How many more would die if these things kept hunting? I made my choice. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the fisherman. Then I sparked the flashlight against a rock, right next to the oil floating on the water. The fire spread faster than anything I've ever seen. The creatures screamed, not like humans, but like whales in pain. The sound was so loud it shook rocks loose from the cave ceiling. I dove underwater and swam for my life, the heat chasing me through the tunnels. Behind me, I could hear them burning. The creatures tried to escape, but the fire was everywhere. The oil had spread through all their caves. Some of them made it to open water. I saw them swimming away, their bodies on fire even underwater. But the fishermen, I can still hear their screams. The smoke and fire trapped them in that deep cave. By the time help finally arrived that evening, it was too late. We found their bodies when the tide went out. The official report says it was an accident, an oil leak and a spark. No one would believe the truth anyway. They filled in most of the caves with concrete after that, just to be safe. But sometimes, on dark nights, I walk down to those rocks and listen. The singing is gone now, but I know some of them survived. I see things moving in the deep water sometimes, just for a second. And I know they remember me. I did what I had to do to stop them. But those 3 fishermen, they haunt me more than any sea creature. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. Every time I hear waves hitting rocks, I remember their last screams. I retired from the Coast Guard after that, moved inland, far from the sea. But here's the thing about the ocean, it's patient. Those creatures have been here longer than us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. So if you're ever near Lighthouse Point at night and you hear singing coming from the water, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because even concrete and fire couldn't kill them all. And the ones that survived, they're still hungry, and they're still waiting. My name is Robert Thompson. Back in 1968, I was a USDA field agent working in Wisconsin. Most of my job involved routine farm inspections, checking livestock, making sure regulations were followed, that sort of thing. But what happened at the Miller farm still haunts me to this day. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear those children's voices. I remember it was early October when I first got the call. Several farmers in Grant County had reported strange deaths of their cattle, not normal deaths, mind you, but something much worse. The animals were found with precise cuts, organs missing, and barely any blood left in their bodies. My supervisor thought it might be some kind of disease outbreak, so he sent me to investigate. The drive to the Miller farm was long and lonely. Their property sat at the end of a dirt road, hidden behind thick pine trees that seemed to block out most of the sunlight. Even before I got out of my car, something felt wrong. The air was heavy and cold, and there was this weird smell, like rotten eggs mixed with something metallic. The farmhouse itself was old but well kept. painted a fading white with dark green shutters. What caught my eye right away were the strange marks carved into the barn doors. At first, I thought they were just regular farm markings, But as I got closer, I could see they were nothing like I'd ever seen before. They looked ancient, like something you'd see in old books about witchcraft. When Mrs. Miller came out to greet me, she seemed normal enough, a thin woman in her 40s wearing a simple dress and apron. But her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her hands kept twitching, like she was nervous about something. Her husband stood in the background, watching me with dark, suspicious eyes. Their twin children, both around 8 years old, peeked out from behind the screen door. They looked pale, too pale, like they hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Little did I know then that this routine inspection would lead me into the darkest case of my career, and that those innocent-looking children would feature in my nightmares for years to come. Mrs. Miller invited me inside for coffee, saying she wanted to tell me about their cattle problems. The house was dark, with thick curtains blocking most of the daylight. Something about the place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the strange-looking dolls lined up on every shelf, or the weird smell of burning herbs mixed with something I couldn't quite place. "We've lost 6 cows in the past month," she said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "Found them in the fields, cut open real clean-like." Her voice was calm, too calm for someone talking about dead animals. "Other farms have it worse," she added, stirring her coffee endlessly. The twins sat in the corner, not playing, not talking, just watching me with those unnaturally dark eyes. When I smiled at them, they didn't smile back. Kids usually love showing off to visitors, but these two, they were different. I asked to see their barn, and Mr. Miller led me out. The moment we stepped inside, I knew something was seriously wrong. The air was thick with the smell of copper, like blood, but stronger. The cattle that were still alive seemed scared, pressing themselves against the back of their stalls, as far away from the center of the barn as they could get. That's when I noticed the floor. Most barns have hay scattered around, but here, the wooden boards were scrubbed clean in a big circle, too clean. And there were those symbols again, carved right into the floorboards. Circles within circles, strange letters I'd never seen before. "Just some old family traditions," Mr. Miller said quickly when he saw me looking. "For good harvests, you understand." But I didn't understand. Not at all. Because right then, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A small red handprint, about the size of a child's hand, hidden behind a stack of hay bales. It was fresh. Standing there in that barn, listening to the nervous shuffling of the cattle and Mr. Miller's too loud breathing, I knew I had to dig deeper. Something terrible was happening at this farm, and those children, those eerily quiet children, they were somehow part of it. I went back to my car to radio for backup, saying I needed to do a thorough farm inspection. But when I tried to use the radio, all I got was static and this weird whispering sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. Just then, I heard singing coming from somewhere behind the barn. It sounded like the twins, but the words weren't English. They weren't any language I'd ever heard. I followed the sound, keeping close to the barn wall. The singing got louder, and now I could hear Mr. and Mrs. Miller's voices too. They were chanting something over and over. I peeked around the corner and saw them all standing in a circle in the back field. The twins were holding hands, swaying back and forth, while their parents spread something dark on the ground. At first, I thought it was fertilizer, but the smell, that metallic smell, it was blood. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I watched them finish whatever crazy ritual they were doing, then snuck back to the barn. I had to find proof of what was going on here, something solid I could show to the police. In the barn, I noticed something odd about the floor where those symbols were carved. When I stepped on one spot, it sounded hollow underneath. I moved some hay bales and found a trap door, hidden so well you'd never spot it unless you knew where to look. The door was heavy, but I managed to lift it without making too much noise. There was a ladder going down into darkness. The smell that came up from that hole, I'll never forget it. It was like death itself. I took out my flashlight and started climbing down. The ladder led to a dirt tunnel that felt like it went on forever. The walls were wet, and there were more of those symbols carved everywhere. But worse than that were the scratch marks, long lines dragged through the dirt by human fingers. At the end of the tunnel, I found a room, and in that room, well, what I saw there changed me forever. But maybe I should warn you before I tell you what was down there. The room was like something from my worst nightmares. My flashlight beam showed me things I wish I could forget. There were bones everywhere, human bones. Some still had bits of flesh on them. In the corners, I found personal belongings, watches, rings, wallets. These weren't just random victims, they were travelers, people who'd gone missing over the years. Against one wall stood an altar made of old wood and bones. On it were jars filled with dark liquid and things I don't even want to describe. There were photos, too, pictures of the Miller family standing over their victims, smiling as they... No, I can't tell you what they were doing in those photos. But the worst part? The twins were in every single picture, their eyes completely black, holding bloody farm tools in their small hands. Suddenly, I heard footsteps above me. Then the twins started singing again, but this time it was right at the top of the ladder. Their voices didn't sound like children anymore. They were deep and wrong, like something else was speaking through them. "Agent Thompson," they called down in unison, "won't you come up and join our harvest?" I turned my flashlight to the ladder and saw them standing there, holding hands like before, but their faces were twisted into smiles that were too wide, showing too many teeth. Their eyes were completely black now, like empty holes in their heads. Mrs. Miller's voice joined in. "The harvest must be fed, Agent Thompson. The land demands it. It's always been this way." I was trapped in that underground chamber, with those things above me and the evidence of their evil all around me. I had my gun, but these were still children, weren't they? I had to make a decision fast, because I could hear Mr. Miller walking down the ladder, step by slow step. I gripped my gun tightly, my hands shaking as Mr. Miller reached the bottom of the ladder. In the dim light, I could see his face had changed too. His skin was gray, and black veins pulsed across his cheeks. When he spoke, his voice sounded like gravel being crushed. "For generations, our family has kept the land fertile," he growled. "The blood feeds the soil, the souls feed our children. You can't stop what's been happening here for hundreds of years." I pointed my gun at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't come any closer." But then Mrs. Miller and the twins started coming down too. The children were crawling down the ladder like spiders, their heads twisted at impossible angles. They were all coming for me at once. I tried one last time. "Please, stop. Think about what you're doing." But when the twins launched themselves at me, their fingers turned into claws. I knew these weren't children anymore. They hadn't been children for a long time. Whatever evil lived in this farm had taken them years ago. What happened next was like a blur. I fired my gun. Again and again. The sound echoed in that underground chamber like thunder. Mr. Miller fell first, then Mrs. Miller. The twins, they were the hardest. Even after several shots, they kept coming. Black liquid pouring from their wounds instead of blood. When it was finally over, I stood there shaking, surrounded by what used to be the Miller family. The silence was deafening after all that noise. But then I heard something else, a rumbling from deep underground. The whole chamber started shaking. The evil in the land wasn't happy about what I'd done. I barely made it up the ladder before the whole underground room caved in, burying all the evidence of the Miller family's horrible crimes. By the time backup arrived, all they found was me, sitting in my car, staring at nothing. Nobody ever believed my full story. The official report just said the Millers resisted arrest and had to be taken down. The truth about what really happened at that farm died with them. But sometimes, when I drive past old farms in Wisconsin, I still check the barns for strange symbols. And when I hear children singing in the distance, I always turn and drive the other way. My name is William Porter, and I've been with the FBI for 15 years. I've seen a lot of strange things in my career, but nothing like what happened in that small Pennsylvania town back in 1973. Even now, I have trouble sleeping when I think about the church below. It started with a simple missing persons case. Well, several missing persons cases. In the tiny town of Mill Grove, Pennsylvania, people had been disappearing. Not all at once, but slowly, over months. First, it was old Mrs. Henderson who lived alone. Then the Parker family, mom, dad, and their teenage daughter. After that, the Wilsons vanished too. By the time I got involved, 12 people had gone missing without a trace. The local police weren't much help. Sheriff Davis kept saying things like, "People move away all the time, and maybe they just wanted a fresh start." But something in his eyes told me he was scared. Really scared. I remember my first visit to St. Michael's Catholic Church. It sat at the edge of town, half buried in the hillside. The stone walls were dark with age, and vines crept up the sides like grasping fingers. The weird thing was, while every other church I'd ever seen tried to reach up to heaven, this one seemed to be sinking into the earth. The front door was unlocked when I tried it. Inside, everything was covered in dust, except for the floor. There were fresh footprints everywhere, leading to a door behind the altar. When I opened it, I found stairs going down into the darkness. I clicked on my flashlight and started down those stairs. The beam caught cobwebs and old paintings of saints on the walls. But their faces, something was wrong with their faces. They didn't look peaceful or holy. They looked hungry. The air got colder with each step, and I could smell something like wet dirt and old candle smoke. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and I had this feeling in my gut that I wasn't alone down there. I was right. At the bottom of the stairs, I found another church, bigger than the one above. Rows of wooden pews stretched into the shadows. Candles burned in holders along the walls, but they gave off hardly any light. And there, on a table near the altar, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a stack of familiar-looking papers. They were the missing persons reports I'd been investigating, but someone had written "renewed" across each one in red ink. I heard something move in the darkness behind me. When I spun around, I saw a figure duck behind a pillar. "FBI!" I shouted, pulling out my gun. "Come out with your hands up!" But when the figure stepped into the candlelight, I almost dropped my weapon. It was Mrs. Henderson, the first person who'd gone missing. Only, it wasn't really her anymore. Her skin was gray, her eyes were completely black, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I saw that her tongue was missing. I ran. I ran up those stairs faster than I've ever moved in my life, but as I reached the top, I heard singing coming from below, dozens of voices, all chanting together in Latin. And I knew deep in my soul that this was only the beginning of the horror I'd discovered in that underground church. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Henderson's gray face and those black, empty eyes. I knew I had to go back to the church, but this time I'd be better prepared. The next morning, I visited the town library to learn more about St. Michael's. The librarian, a nervous woman named Sarah, pulled out some old newspapers for me. Her hands shook as she laid them on the table. "You shouldn't be looking into this," she whispered, glancing around even though we were alone. "Father Malcolm. He changed after his wife died last year." The church services started going longer and longer. People who attended the late-night masses, they started acting strange. Some stopped coming out during the day at all. I spent hours reading through the papers. The church had been built in 1892, but the interesting part was what I found in an article from 6 months ago. There had been a cave-in behind the church, revealing a network of old tunnels. Father Malcolm had been excited about the discovery, calling it a sign from God. That afternoon, I talked to Tommy Wilson, the teenage son who hadn't disappeared with the rest of his family. He'd been away at his grandmother's when they vanished. Dad started going to those midnight services, Tommy told me, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He'd come home talking weird stuff about eternal life and how Father Malcolm had the secret. Mom went with him one night to see what was happening. A week later, they both disappeared. I waited until sunset before going back to the church. This time, I brought a better flashlight, my gun, and a camera. The stone walls seemed to watch me as I made my way down those stairs again. The underground church was different this time. Candles were lit everywhere, and the air smelled like incense and something else, something rotting. I found more papers scattered on the altar, ancient-looking pages covered in Latin writing and drawings of human bodies with strange symbols. In a small room off to the side, I discovered Father Malcolm's private study. His journal was lying open on the desk. The latest entry made my skin crawl. God has shown me the way. Death is not the end, it is merely a door. Through the old rituals, we can open that door. My beloved congregation understands now. Soon, we will all be eternal. Even my dear Elizabeth will return to me. I heard footsteps behind me, lots of them. Turning around, I saw shadows moving in the main chamber. Through the doorway, I watched as people began filing into the pews. But they weren't really people anymore. Their skin was all gray like Mrs. Henderson's, and they moved like puppets on strings. At the front of the church stood Father Malcolm in his black robes. He was a tall man with wild gray hair and eyes that burned with a scary kind of joy. He held up his hands, and the shuffling congregation grew quiet. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Tonight, we welcome more faithful to our eternal flock." Two of the gray-skinned people dragged forward a woman I recognized, Sarah, the librarian. She was crying and trying to break free. I wanted to help her, but there were too many of them between us. I pressed myself against the wall of the study, holding my breath. I needed to get help, but first I had to get out of there alive. As Father Malcolm began to chant in Latin, I realized with horror that I was about to witness exactly what happened to all those missing people. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. From my hiding spot in Father Malcolm's study, I watched as two of the gray-skinned people held Sarah down on the altar. She had stopped screaming, but tears ran down her face. Father Malcolm raised an old book above his head. "Through death, we find true life," he shouted. The undead congregation swayed and hummed. The sound made my teeth hurt. "Elizabeth, my love, soon everyone in this town will be like us. No one will ever have to say goodbye again." That's when I understood. Father Malcolm had lost his wife, Elizabeth, and he'd completely lost his mind trying to bring her back. But whatever he was doing wasn't bringing back real people, it was creating these things. I needed proof before I could call for backup. Moving as quietly as I could, I raised my camera. The flash would give me away, but I had to risk it. I aimed carefully, making sure to get Father Malcolm and the crowd in the shot. Click, flash. Everything stopped. Every gray face turned toward me. Father Malcolm's eyes were wide with anger. "A non-believer," he screamed. "Stop him. He mustn't interfere with our holy work." I ran. Behind me, I could hear dozens of shuffling footsteps and Father Malcolm's angry shouts. I knocked over candles as I went, trying to slow them down. The undead people didn't run. They couldn't. But there were so many of them. I reached the stairs, taking them two at a time. Something grabbed my ankle, a gray hand reaching between the steps. I kicked free and kept running. My lungs were burning. At the top of the stairs, I slammed the door shut and pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it. Banging sounds came from the other side. Through the wood, I could hear Father Malcolm yelling, "You cannot stop God's work. We will all be together forever." I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. Father Malcolm stood in the church doorway, watching me leave. Behind him, gray faces pressed against every window. Back at my motel, I called my supervisor in Pittsburgh. "Sir, you're not going to believe this, but I need every agent you can send. And bring the bomb squad." "Bomb squad?" he asked. "Porter, what's going on down there?" I looked at the photos I'd taken. They had come out clear as day. Father Malcolm standing at his altar, surrounded by his congregation of undead followers. In the background, I could see Sarah struggling, and the Book of Dark Rituals. "Sir," I said, "we've got a priest who's raising the dead. He's got at least 50 people down there, maybe more, and he's planning to do it to the whole town." There was a long silence on the phone. Then, "We'll be there by midnight." I sat down on my bed, gun in my lap, facing the door. I could still hear that horrible humming sound the congregation made. Midnight was 3 hours away. I just hoped Sarah could hold on until then, and that none of Father Malcolm's followers knew where I was staying. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, shuffling footsteps. The footsteps got closer to my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I grabbed my gun and backed into the corner. Then I heard a knock. "Agent Porter?" It was Tommy Wilson's voice. "Please, let me in. They're after me." I opened the door just enough to see Tommy's face. He was alive and normal, not gray like the others. I pulled him inside quickly and locked the door. "They came to my house," he said, breathing hard. "My parents. They're not my parents anymore. They tried to take me to the church. Backup is coming," I told him. "We just need to stay alive for 3 more hours." But then my phone rang. It was my supervisor again. "Porter, the roads are blocked. Trees have fallen across every way into town. It's like someone knew we were coming. We're trying to find another way in, but it'll take hours to clear the roads." I looked at Tommy. "We can't wait. Sarah's in there, and Father Malcolm is going to do to her what he did to the others. We have to go back." "I know another way in," Tommy said quietly. "When I was little, I found old tunnels that lead to the church basement. That's how I followed my parents that night and saw what Father Malcolm was doing. The tunnels start in the woods behind my house. It was crazy, but it was our only chance. We took my car most of the way, then walked through the woods. Tommy led me to a rusty metal door hidden under some bushes. It creaked when we opened it. The tunnel was narrow and smelled like wet dirt. Our flashlight beams bounced off the walls as we walked. After what felt like forever, we heard chanting above us. "We're under the church," Tommy whispered. We found some old wooden steps that led up to a trap door. Through the cracks, we could see candlelight. The chanting was louder now. They were getting ready to do the ritual. "Tommy, listen to me," I said. "I saw something in the basement earlier. Boxes of old dynamite, probably from when they dug these tunnels. If we can't stop them any other way." He nodded, understanding what I meant. I checked my watch. It was almost midnight. Above us, Father Malcolm's voice rang out, "Bring forth the new believer." I heard Sarah cry out. "Now or never," I whispered to Tommy. "Ready?" He looked scared but brave. "Ready." I pushed open the trapdoor and climbed up, gun drawn. "FBI, everyone stay where you are." The undead congregation turned to look at us. Sarah was on the altar, with Father Malcolm standing over her holding a black knife. The knife's blade seemed to drink in the candlelight. "You're too late," Father Malcolm said with a smile that wasn't sane at all. "My faithful are everywhere now. You cannot stop us." He was right. Looking around, I saw more gray faces than I remembered. He'd been busy while I was gone. I recognized the motel owner, some local shop workers, even the sheriff among them now. "The boy," Father Malcolm said suddenly, noticing Tommy. "Ah, young Thomas, your parents have been waiting for you." From the crowd, Tommy's mom and dad stepped forward. Their gray skin looked almost black in the candlelight. "Those aren't my parents anymore," Tommy said, his voice shaking. I had to keep them talking while I moved closer to Sarah. "Why, Father? Why do this?" "Because death is a lie," he shouted. "When Elizabeth died, I found the truth in the old books. God doesn't want us to die. He wants us to live forever. Look at my beautiful congregation. No one ages. No one leaves. We're one big, happy, eternal family." "They're not alive," I said. "They're just empty shells." "You're wrong." Father Malcolm raised the knife. "Let me show you. Once the knife drinks your blood, you'll understand. You'll join us. Everyone will join us." I fired my gun at his hand. The knife flew across the room. The congregation started moving toward us, slow but steady. There were too many of them. "Tommy, get Sarah!" I shouted. "Head for the tunnels." Tommy ran to the altar while I kept my gun pointed at Father Malcolm. But the undead people were closing in from all sides. Cold, gray hands grabbed at my clothes. "Now, Tommy," I yelled. "The dynamite." Tommy had gotten Sarah free. They were running for the trap door. I fought my way through the crowd, following them. The gray hands were so strong, so cold. We made it to the tunnel. I slammed the trap door shut and pushed a beam across it. Above us, Father Malcolm was screaming about God's will. "The dynamite's over there," Tommy pointed. There were 3 old wooden boxes of it. "Both of you, run," I said. "Get as far as you can. I'll light it." "But you won't have time to," Sarah started to say. "Run, now!" They ran. I could hear the trap door creaking as they tried to break through from above. I grabbed my lighter and looked at all that dynamite. It would bring down the whole underground church. I lit the fuse. I ran as fast as I could, but the explosion came too fast. The blast threw me forward. Everything went black. I woke up in a hospital 3 days later. Tommy and Sarah were okay. The underground church had collapsed, burying Father Malcolm and his congregation of 200 undead followers. The regular church above had fallen in too. The official report says it was a gas explosion. Nobody would believe the truth anyway. The townspeople who were left just wanted to forget. Sometimes I drive past Mill Grove. There's nothing left of the church except a big hole in the ground that nobody wants to build on. At night, people say they can hear singing coming from deep underground. I believe them, because sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear that horrible humming sound. And I wonder if maybe, deep under all that dirt and stone, Father Malcolm and his faithful are still down there, singing their endless midnight mass. My name is Thomas Walker, and I'm still haunted by what happened in the Mississippi swamps back in 1978. I was a young CDC agent then, eager to prove myself, but nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I found in that small village hidden deep in the murky waters. It started with a phone call on a hot summer morning. My boss called me into his office, his face serious as he handed me a file. "Walker, we've got something strange brewing in Mississippi. People are getting sick, but it's different. Local authorities are in over their heads." I packed my bags that same day and drove down to Cypress Creek, a tiny dot on the map surrounded by endless swampland. The air was thick and sticky, filled with buzzing mosquitoes and the loud croaking of frogs. Spanish moss hung from the trees like gray curtains, making everything look sad and gloomy. When I pulled up to the local police station, Sheriff Miller was waiting for me. He was a big man with tired eyes and sweat stains on his uniform. "Glad you're here, Agent Walker," he said, not looking glad at all. "We've got 8 people sick already. Started last week, and it ain't like any flu I've ever seen." The sheriff drove me to the clinic where they were keeping the sick people. On the way, he told me how it began. First was old Joe Barnes. Started with a fever, nothing special. But then, he shook his head. He changed, started acting wild, trying to bite people. We thought he'd gone crazy from the heat. The local doctor, Dr. Sarah Chen, met us at the clinic door. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "It's spreading," she whispered, leading us inside, "and we don't know how to stop it." What I saw in that clinic changed my life forever. The patients were strapped to their beds, thrashing and snarling like wild animals. Their eyes were clouded over with a milky white film, and their skin was covered in strange dark veins. But worst of all was the hunger they showed, not for food, but for human flesh. As I stood there watching these people I didn't know yet had to help, an old woman grabbed my arm through the bars of her bed. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her cloudy eyes locked onto mine. "The curse," she hissed. "The curse is in the blood, carried by the Skeeters. He promised revenge, and now we're all gonna pay." I pulled my arm free, trying to stay professional, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Something terrible was happening in this swamp, something that went beyond normal science and medicine. And somehow, I had to stop it before it spread beyond this small, forgotten corner of Mississippi. That was my first day in Cypress Creek. I wish I could say it was the worst day, but I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The next morning I started my investigation with Dr. Chen at my side. We walked from house to house in the steamy heat, talking to families about who got sick first and how. The more we heard, the less sense it made. "It always starts the same way, Doctor," Chen said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "First comes the fever, then the dark veins appear. By day 3, they're not themselves anymore." We stopped at the Barnes house first. Mrs. Barnes, a thin woman with shaking hands, served us sweet tea while telling us about her husband Joe. He was fine that Sunday after church, just complained about some mosquito bites. By Wednesday, he was burning up with fever. Then she started crying. He tried to bite our grandson. As we walked to the next house, I noticed something strange. Every infected person had been in or near the old cypress grove, a patch of swamp that locals avoided. When I asked about it, Dr. Chen got real quiet. "That's where old Marcel lived," she whispered. "He was a voodoo practitioner. The town forced him out last year, said he was dangerous. He swore he'd make everyone pay." She looked around nervously. "He disappeared into the swamp. Some say he died out there." Just then we heard screaming from nearby. We ran toward the sound and found a teenage boy wrestling with his infected mother in their front yard. She had broken free from her room and was trying to bite him, her eyes milky white and wild. My training kicked in. I pulled the boy away while Dr. Chen called for help. But what happened next still gives me nightmares. The woman turned to me, and I swear she smiled. Not a normal smile. It was like something else was looking through her eyes. She spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, deep and scratchy. "The mosquitoes are just the beginning, Agent Walker. His revenge flows through their wings." The sheriff's men arrived and took her away, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. That night, in my motel room, I looked at my notes and started connecting the dots. Every victim had been bitten by mosquitoes near the old cypress grove. Every victim showed the same pattern: fever, dark veins, then the hunger. I called the CDC lab with my findings, but they just laughed when I mentioned voodoo. "Stick to the science, Walker," my boss said. But science wasn't explaining what I was seeing. That's when I heard a tap at my window. Through the glass, I saw hundreds of mosquitoes gathering, forming a pattern that looked almost like a face that seemed to be laughing at me. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting a disease. I was fighting something much older, much darker. And time was running out. By day 5, things got much worse. The infected count jumped from 8 to 20 people. The small clinic couldn't hold them all anymore. Sheriff Miller turned the old community center into a makeshift hospital, but even that wasn't enough. I was running tests on blood samples when Dr. Chen burst into the lab. "Thomas, you need to see this." Her hands were shaking as she led me to a patient. "Look at their blood under the microscope." What I saw shocked me. The blood cells were changing shape, turning dark, and there were these tiny black dots moving through them, something I'd never seen before in any disease. 3 more families got sick last night, Sheriff Miller reported. All of them live near the creek that runs from Cypress Grove. He pointed to a map on the wall, the infections following the water. That afternoon I saw the true horror of what we were dealing with. I was checking on Mrs. Barnes when she somehow broke free from her restraints. Before anyone could stop her, she bit a nurse. The poor woman screamed and fell to the ground. We got Mrs. Barnes under control, but the nurse's fever started just 30 minutes later. The infection was spreading faster now. I called an emergency meeting with the town council. "We need to evacuate," I told them. But before they could answer, we heard gunshots outside. We ran out to find chaos. 5 infected people had broken out. They were running through the streets, trying to bite anyone they could catch. I saw a mother grab her kids and lock herself in her car. An old man hit an infected person with his walking stick, trying to keep them away. "Get everyone inside," I shouted. The sheriff's men managed to catch 4 of the infected, but one got away, heading straight for the next town. That night, I snuck out to Cypress Grove. I had to know the truth. The swamp was dead quiet. No frogs, no crickets, nothing. Just the buzz of mosquitoes. They were everywhere, their wings glowing slightly in the moonlight. I swear they were watching me. Near an old shack, I found Marcel's journal. The pages were wet and moldy, but I could still read some parts. He wrote about a ritual, something about putting his spirit into the blood of mosquitoes. He wanted everyone to feel the pain of being pushed out, of being alone. Suddenly, my flashlight caught something moving in the water. Hundreds of infected mosquitoes were rising from the swamp, like a dark cloud. And in the shadows between the trees, I saw people watching. Infected people, their white eyes glowing in the darkness. I ran back to my car as fast as I could, but as I drove away, I knew we'd waited too long. The infection wasn't just spreading anymore. It was hunting us. I knew I needed help understanding what we were really fighting. Doctor. Chen told me about Marcel's sister Marie, who lived on the outskirts of town. She knows about the old ways, she whispered. But be careful, people say she's as powerful as her brother was. The path to Marie's house was barely visible, hidden by tall grass and hanging moss. Her home was small, with strange symbols painted on the door. When she opened it, her eyes seemed to look right through me. "I've been waiting for you, Agent Walker," she said. "The spirits told me you'd come." Inside, Marie made tea while I told her everything. About the mosquitoes, the infections, her brother's journal. She listened quietly, nodding like she already knew. "Marcel was my twin," she said softly. "When they forced him out, something broke inside him. He spent months in that swamp, planning his revenge. The night he disappeared, I felt him change into something dark, something angry." She got up and pulled out an old book. He used the darkest magic, putting his spirit into the mosquitoes. Every bite spreads not just infection, but his hate. His need to make others suffer like he did. "Can we stop it?" I asked. Marie's face grew sad. "The infection lives in the water now, in the mosquitoes, in the infected people. There's only one way to end this." She looked straight into my eyes. "Everything infected must burn. The swamp, the grove, the victims, all of it. Or the infection will spread beyond this town, beyond the state. No place will be safe." Just then, we heard screaming outside. Through the window, I saw more people running, some with those milky white eyes. The infected were breaking out everywhere now. "It's happening faster," Marie said, her voice shaking. "Marcel's power is growing. Soon, those infected won't just bite. They'll start to change even more. Become something that's not human anymore." She grabbed my arm. "You have one chance, Agent Walker. By sunrise tomorrow, the change will be complete. After that, not even fire will stop them." As if to prove her point, we heard a sound outside that wasn't quite human, not quite animal either. Something new, something hungry. I left Marie's house knowing what I had to do. But knowing didn't make it any easier. These were people, mothers, fathers, children, people I was supposed to save. But as the sun set, I could hear them out there in the growing darkness, moving, changing, hunting. And I knew I was out of time. I knew what had to be done, but my hands were shaking as I called the CDC and Sheriff Miller. "We need to evacuate everyone who's not infected," I said. "And we need gasoline, lots of it." The sheriff looked at me like I was crazy, but when we heard another inhuman scream from the community center, he understood. We didn't have any other choice. By midnight, we had moved all the healthy people to the next town. Dr. Chen helped, though I could see she was crying as she loaded the last families into trucks. "What about the infected?" she asked me. I couldn't look her in the eye. "You should go too, Sarah." The infected were getting stronger. They had broken through the steel doors of the community center, and now they were gathering in the streets. Their skin had turned gray, with black veins bulging out. Some were walking on all fours like animals. In the darkness, their white eyes glowed like small moons. I drove my truck to Cypress Grove first. Marie was right. Everything infected had to burn. The mosquitoes were thick here, forming weird shapes in the air. As I poured gasoline around the trees and the old shack, I felt like they were watching me. planning something. Then I heard it, a deep voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "They forced me out," it said. "Now everyone will know how it feels to be alone, to be changed, to be hated." Marcel's voice. But not just his voice. I could hear all the infected people speaking with him, like a horrible choir. I lit the first match with shaking hands. The fire caught fast, spreading through the swamp. The mosquitoes tried to escape, but the smoke was too thick. I heard that voice scream in anger. Then came the hardest part. The community center. The infected were inside, and they were changing faster now. Some didn't even look human anymore. I knew the people they used to be were already gone. Sheriff Miller helped me surround the building with gasoline. "God forgive us," he whispered as I struck another match. The fire spread fast, too fast. The infected tried to run out, but we had blocked the doors. Their screams. I'll never forget those screams. As the buildings burned, a huge swarm of mosquitoes rose up, trying to escape. But they couldn't. The smoke was everywhere. In the flames, I thought I saw Marcel's face one last time, twisted with anger. Then it was gone. We stayed until morning, making sure everything was destroyed. The fire department from the next town helped us control the flames, keep them from spreading beyond what needed to be burned. The official report says it was a disease outbreak, contained by CDC protocols. 50 people died. The town was abandoned. But everyone who was there knows the truth. Sometimes, on hot summer nights, I still dream about Cypress Creek, about the infected people, the mosquitoes, and Marcel's revenge. I wake up sweating, checking my skin for dark veins. And when I hear mosquitoes buzzing outside my window, I always make sure to close it tight, because I know what can happen when hate becomes a disease, when revenge finds a way to spread. Some fevers can burn away more than just your body. They can burn away everything you are. My name is Michael Harrison, and I'm a Department of Labor mine safety investigator. After 15 years on the job, I thought I'd seen every kind of mining accident possible. Cave-ins, gas leaks, equipment failures. I'd investigated them all. But what I found in that Kentucky coal mine in 1983 still haunts my dreams. It started with a routine call about unusual accidents at the Blackwood mine, just outside a small town called Pine Creek. 3 miners had died in separate incidents over 2 months. That might not sound like much, but these weren't normal mining accidents. The bodies were found wrong. The local police reports didn't make sense, and the mine owners were getting nervous. I remember driving into Pine Creek on a cold October morning. The town was like many others I'd seen. A few streets of homes, a diner, a gas station, and the mine that kept everything alive. Most of the men worked underground, while their wives ran the shops or taught at the small school. But something felt off from the moment I arrived. People would stop talking when I walked into the diner. Miners would look away when I tried to make eye contact. Little did I know then that investigating these accidents would force me to make the hardest decision of my life. Sometimes at night, I still hear the screams echoing through those dark tunnels, and I wonder if I made the right choice. This is the story of what really happened in the Blackwood mine, and why 12 good men never came back up. I started my investigation by talking to Jim Tucker, the mine supervisor. He was a big man with rough hands and tired eyes. We sat in his small office above the mine entrance, where the walls were covered with safety certificates and old maps. 3 deaths in 2 months, Mr. Harrison, Jim said, his voice shaking a little. I've been running mines for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. He pulled out some photos from his desk drawer but hesitated before showing them to me. The first victim was Tom Kelly, found dead in Tunnel 4. The second was Mike Reeves in Tunnel 7. And just last week, they found David Chen in one of the deepest parts of the mine. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just that they were dead, it was how they were found. The bodies, Jim whispered, finally sliding the photos across his desk. They were skinned, like something had carefully peeled away every inch of their skin. The police are calling them animal attacks, but—" He shook his head. "No animal I know does something like this." That afternoon I interviewed Sarah Kelly, Tom's widow. She sat on her front porch, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Tom knew something was wrong," she told me. "The week before he died, he said he kept hearing things in the mine. Not normal sounds like dripping water or settling rocks. He said it sounded like singing, but not human singing." I wrote everything down in my notebook, but something else caught my attention. On Sarah's porch was a local history book, marked with a ribbon. "Tom was reading this," she said, following my gaze. "He was obsessed with old mining stories the last few weeks. Said he needed to understand what was down there." That night, in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could almost hear what Tom had described, a strange, inhuman singing, echoing up from the deep, dark earth. The next morning I went down into the mine. Jim gave me a hard hat with a light, and 2 experienced miners, Pete and Bobby, as guides. The elevator ride down was the longest 3 minutes of my life. The deeper we went, the colder it got. "We'll show you where we found Tom first," Pete said, his voice bouncing off the tunnel walls. Our lights made long shadows as we walked through Tunnel 4. The air smelled like wet earth and something else I couldn't quite name. Bobby kept looking over his shoulder every few minutes. "You'll think I'm crazy," he said quietly, "but sometimes I feel like something's watching us down here. Ever since Tom died, things have been different. Tools go missing. We hear noises that shouldn't be there." We reached the spot where they found Tom. There was still some yellow police tape on the ground. I shined my light around, looking for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the marks on the wall, long scratches that didn't look like they were made by mining equipment. "Those weren't there yesterday," Pete said, his voice shaking. "I swear those weren't there." Suddenly, my light caught something shiny on the ground. I bent down to look closer. It was a piece of metal, an old mining tag from 1922. It was covered in some kind of slime that made my fingers tingle when I touched it. Then we heard it, a sound that made us all freeze. From somewhere deeper in the mine came a noise that wasn't machinery, wasn't dripping water, and wasn't the earth settling. It was like someone humming a tune, but wrong somehow, like the sound was coming from something that didn't have human vocal cords. Bobby's face went white. "We need to get out of here, now." But I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Whatever was killing these miners was still down here, and I had to find out what it was. I just didn't know then how much that knowledge would cost. That's when the lights on our hard hats started flickering. Not all at once, but one by one, like something was playing with them. Bobby grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Mr. Harrison," he whispered, "look at the ground." Our lights showed something dark and wet moving across the tunnel floor. At first, I thought it was water, but water doesn't move against gravity. This liquid was crawling up the walls, leaving shiny trails that seemed to pulse in our fading lights. Then Pete screamed. Something had brushed against his neck, something cold and scaly. We turned to run, but in the panic, we took a wrong turn. The tunnels all looked the same in the dark, and our lights were getting dimmer by the second. "We need to call for help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I reached for my radio, but all we got was static and a sound that made my skin crawl. That same inhuman humming, now coming through the radio speaker. We found ourselves in a part of the mine none of us knew. The walls here were different, older looking, with strange carvings I'd never seen in a coal mine before. Our lights showed what looked like ancient drawings of something tall and twisted, with too many limbs. "This isn't right," Pete said. "These tunnels aren't on any map. They can't be part of our mine." That's when we heard the scraping sound behind us. It was like someone dragging metal across rock, getting closer and closer. But what we saw when we turned around, I still have trouble putting it into words. It was tall, maybe twice the height of a man. Its skin looked like wet coal, but it moved like oil. And its face, where a face should be, there was just a dark hole that seemed to swallow our remaining light. I've never run so fast in my life. We barely made it back to the elevator, and the whole way up, we could hear that thing following us, its claws scratching against the shaft walls. Back in the safety of daylight, I knew two things for certain. I finally understood what had killed those miners, and I had to find a way to stop it before it killed again. I spent that night in the town library, digging through old newspapers and mining records. My hands were still shaking as I turned the yellow pages. The librarian, an old woman named Mrs. Clark, watched me with worried eyes. "You found something down there, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "Something that shouldn't exist." She brought me a book from the restricted section, dated 1922. Inside were reports of similar deaths, miners found without their skin, strange noises in the tunnels, and mysterious cave-ins. But what caught my eye was a photograph of miners standing in front of a tunnel. Behind them, carved into the rock, were the same symbols we'd seen today. "My grandfather was a miner back then," Mrs. Clark said. "He told me stories about what they awakened when they dug too deep. They thought they'd sealed it away, buried it under tons of rock. But I guess some things can't stay buried forever." Just then my phone rang. It was Jim, his voice filled with panic. "Harrison, we've got 20 men trapped down there. Something collapsed Tunnel 7 and—" He paused and I heard screams in the background. "Oh God, we can hear it in there with them." I rushed to the mine. Families were gathered around the entrance, crying and praying. The rescue team was getting ready to go down, but I knew we couldn't just send more people into that thing's hunting ground. That's when I realized what we had to do. The old reports mentioned how they'd tried to trap it before. Maybe, with modern explosives, we could seal it away for good. But the thought that made my stomach turn was knowing that anyone still alive down there would be sealed in too. 20 lives against the entire town. How do you make a choice like that? Time was running out. I could hear the screams getting weaker through the radio. Of the 20 trapped miners, only 12 were still responding. The creature was picking them off, one by one. "I know what we have to do," I told Jim, pulling him aside where the families couldn't hear. "We have to collapse the entire section. It's the only way to stop this thing." Jim's face went white. "But the men will die anyway if that thing gets them," I finished. My voice cracked as I said it. "And if we don't stop it now, it'll keep killing. The whole town could be next." We worked fast, setting up the explosives at key points. I got on the radio to talk to the survivors. I couldn't tell them what we were about to do. I couldn't bear to. Instead, I told them to stay together, to keep away from the dark corners. I heard Brad Miller's voice, telling his friends to be brave. I heard Mike Watson asking me to tell his kids he loved them. My hands were shaking as I reached for the detonator. The families were being moved back, told there was going to be a controlled blast to try to reach the trapped men. I'll never forget their hopeful faces. "God forgive me," I whispered, and pressed the button. The ground shook like an earthquake. Dust billowed from the mine entrance. And then, silence. The most terrible silence I've ever heard. We sealed up the mine entrance with concrete the next day. The official report said it was a tragic mining accident. 12 men lost to a cave-in. But the people of Pine Creek know the truth. They don't mine that deep anymore. Sometimes, on quiet nights, people say they can still hear something humming from beneath the earth. And when they do, they hurry home and lock their doors, grateful for the sacrifice those 12 men made. I left my job after that. Couldn't face another mine. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering if we really trapped that thing down there, or if it's just waiting, growing stronger, until someone digs too deep again. My name is Donald Foster, and I've been a park ranger in the White Mountains of New Hampshire for 15 years. What happened at Camp Pine Lakes in the summer of 1987 still haunts me every night. I need to write it all down. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. It started with a phone call about 2 missing kids from the camp. Nothing unusual at first. Every summer we get calls about campers wandering off trail. Usually we find them within a few hours, scared and hungry but otherwise fine. But something felt different this time. When I drove up to Camp Pine Lakes that morning, the air felt heavy and cold, even though it was middle of July. The camp director, Mike Thompson, met me at the main office. His face was pale, and his hands wouldn't stop shaking as he told me about Tommy and Sarah, both 12, who hadn't shown up for breakfast. "We've looked everywhere," Mike said, his voice cracking. "Their beds weren't slept in, and none of the other kids saw them after the campfire last night." I started my search near their cabins, following standard procedure. But as I walked through the camp, I noticed something strange. The birds had stopped singing. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never heard these woods so quiet. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. What I didn't know then was that those 2 missing kids were just the beginning. I had no idea I was about to face the darkest days of my life, or that by the end of the week, I'd be forced to make a decision that would haunt me forever. And it all started because some greedy developers didn't listen to the local tribe's warnings about building on sacred ground. I called for backup and started searching the woods with my flashlight. Even though it was daytime, something told me I needed the extra light. The missing kids' cabin counselor, Jenny, walked with me, telling me about Tommy and Sarah. "They were such good kids," she said quietly. "Tommy was afraid of the dark, so Sarah would always let him borrow her little bear-shaped nightlight. That's what's weird, the nightlight's gone too." As we walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd about the ground. Dead leaves and pine needles were arranged in perfect circles, like someone or something had carefully swept them that way. Jenny saw them too and grabbed my arm. "Mr. Foster," she whispered, "I need to tell you something. Last night, during the campfire, Tommy said he heard singing coming from the old part of the woods. Sarah heard it too. But when I went to check, there was nothing there." My radio crackled, making us both jump. It was Mike, the camp director. "Don, you need to come back," his voice shook. 3 more kids are missing now. And we found something in the dining hall." When we got back, I saw what he meant. All the tables in the dining hall had been moved, not thrown around, carefully arranged in a giant spiral. And at the center was a small pile of dirt mixed with what looked like old bone fragments. That's when I remembered the stories the local tribal elders had told the camp developers 3 years ago. Stories about an ancient burial ground and warnings about disturbing the rest of their ancestors. Stories nobody had listened to. I looked at my watch. It was only 2 p.m., but the sky outside was getting darker, and in the distance, very faintly, I could hear what sounded like singing. Things got worse as the sun started to set. I was in my truck, calling the state police for help, when one of the counselors started screaming from inside the Arts and Crafts building. I ran inside and found Jenny staring at Lisa, another counselor. Lisa was standing perfectly still, facing the corner. She was humming something that didn't sound like any song I'd ever heard. "Lisa?" I called out. "Are you okay?" When she turned around, I nearly dropped my flashlight. Her face looked normal, but her eyes, they were completely white, like milk, and she was smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "They're coming back," Lisa said, but her voice sounded strange, like 3 people talking at once. "They want their home back." Jenny grabbed my arm. "Don, look at the walls." All the kids' artwork was changing. The happy summer camp drawings were turning dark, trees becoming twisted shapes, stick figure campers getting longer and longer until they didn't look human anymore. And it was happening right in front of us, like invisible hands were drawing with black crayons. We backed out of the building slowly. That's when we heard more screaming from the cabins. Kids were running out into the gathering darkness. Some counselors tried to catch them, but stopped when they saw what I saw, more and more people with those milky white eyes. "Get everyone who's still normal to the main lodge," I shouted to Jenny. "Now!" As we ran, I could see more possessed people walking out of the woods. Some were the missing kids, but they moved like puppets on strings. They were all humming that same awful song. In the lodge, I counted 30 people who weren't possessed yet, mostly younger campers and a few staff. We locked the doors, but I knew that wouldn't hold for long. And worse, my radio wasn't working anymore, just static and what sounded like that horrible humming. Inside the lodge, we could hear them surrounding us. The humming got louder and louder until it felt like the whole building was shaking. One of the little kids started crying, and I knew I had to do something fast. "Mr. Foster," Jenny whispered, "look at the floor." Dark water was seeping in under the doors, but it wasn't normal water. It moved like it was alive, creeping toward us in thin black lines. And everywhere it touched, the wood started to rot. I gathered everyone in the center of the room. "Listen carefully," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a storage cellar under the kitchen. The door's hidden under the rug. We need to get down there now." Just then, the windows exploded inward. The possessed people began climbing in, kids, counselors, and others I didn't even recognize. Their white eyes glowed in the darkness, and they all moved together like they were part of one thing. We rushed to the kitchen. I helped everyone down into the cellar while Jenny held the flashlight. But before I could close the trap door, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The possessed people weren't trying to catch us. They were gathering wood, chairs, anything that could burn, and piling it around the lodge. That's when I realized what they wanted, what the spirits wanted. They were going to burn everything down, the whole camp, with all of us inside. I looked at the scared faces in the cellar, then at the gas line running along the kitchen wall. I knew there was only one way to end this, one way to stop these spirits before they could spread beyond the camp. "Jenny," I said, handing her the keys to my truck, "there's a tunnel at the back of this cellar. It was used to store ice in the old days. It leads out to the lake. Get everyone out that way. Don't stop, don't look back, just run." "What about you?" she asked, but I think she already knew. "I have to end this, the only way I know how." I waited until I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore in the tunnel. Then I climbed back up to the kitchen. The possessed people were everywhere now, still piling things up to burn. They moved like they were sleepwalking, but their white eyes followed me. I turned on all the gas stoves, but didn't light them. The sweet smell of gas started filling the air. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my emergency flares. Tommy, one of the first kids who went missing, walked up to me. His eyes were completely white now, and his voice sounded ancient when he spoke. "This is our land," he said in that horrible multi-voice. "We will take it back." "I know," I said quietly, "but not like this." I could hear Jenny's group splashing through the tunnel. They'd be reaching the lake soon. The possessed people started moving closer, still humming that awful song. The gas smell was getting stronger. I looked at my watch. 3 minutes. That should be enough time for the others to get far away. The possessed people were almost touching me now. I could feel their cold breath on my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and lit the flare. The explosion was bigger than I expected. Somehow, I survived the first blast and found myself outside, watching the flames reach into the night sky. The humming had stopped. In the fire, I thought I saw shapes rising up, like people made of smoke, floating away into the darkness. All 30 of the possessed people were still inside. I could have tried to save them, but I knew they were already gone. The spirits had taken them, and this was the only way to set them free. I sat there until morning, watching the camp burn. When the fire trucks finally came, I told them about the gas leak, about how the possessed people had trapped themselves inside. Nobody would have believed the real story. Jenny kept my secret. So did the others who escaped through the tunnel. Some stories are better left untold. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear that humming in the woods, and I know they're still out there, waiting for someone else to build on their land. My name is Peter Morgan, and I've been working as a health and human services agent for the past 12 years. Most of my job involves checking up on hospitals and making sure they follow the rules. But what happened last winter in Vermont still keeps me up at night. It started with a phone call on a cold December morning. My boss wanted me to check out an old mental hospital that had been closed for years. People in the nearby town had been going missing, mostly homeless folks who had no one looking for them. The local police thought they were just moving somewhere warmer for the winter, but something didn't feel right. This case hit close to home for me. You see, my sister Sarah spent time in a mental hospital when we were younger. She got the help she needed and got better, but I've always felt protective of people who struggle with mental health. That's why I became an HHS agent in the first place. When I first drove up to the Vermont State Mental Hospital, something felt off. The building was huge and gray, with broken windows and ivy growing all over the walls. It looked dead, but not quite abandoned. Fresh tire tracks marked the snow in the parking lot, and I could have sworn I saw a light in one of the upper windows. The front door was supposed to be locked, but it opened with just a push. The smell hit me first. Hospitals usually smell like cleaning supplies, but this place had a weird mix of rot and something else. Something metallic. My flashlight beam showed dusty floors with fresh footprints leading down the main hallway. I'd checked out closed hospitals before, but they usually just had some teens breaking in to take pictures or homeless people looking for shelter. This felt different. The footprints were too organized, too purposeful, and there were weird marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. As I walked deeper into the building, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in white puffs, and the beam of my flashlight caught something strange on the wall, fresh scratch marks about shoulder height. Next to them was a bulletin board with old papers still pinned to it. One caught my eye: Project Nightfall, Test Subject Requirements. I took out my phone to call for backup, but there was no signal. That's when I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. Somewhere below me, someone was screaming. Little did I know I was about to uncover something far worse than just an abandoned building. Something that would make me question everything I knew about human nature and force me to make the hardest decision of my life. I knew I should have turned around and called for help. That would have been the smart thing to do. But those screams, they reminded me too much of my sister Sarah during her bad days. I had to know if someone needed help. The basement stairs creaked under my feet as I made my way down. My flashlight beam caught something odd on the walls, fresh paint, while the rest of the hospital was falling apart. This section looked new. There were shiny pipes running along the ceiling, and the air felt weirdly warm. That's when I found the first room. It looked like a doctor's office, but everything was too modern. Papers were scattered across a desk, and a cup of coffee was still warm. Someone had been here just minutes ago. I started reading through the files, and my hands began to shake. They were patient records, but not from the old days. These were recent. Each folder had photos of homeless people I recognized from the missing persons reports. The notes inside made my stomach turn. Subject 27 shows promising energy absorption rates. Subject 29 failed to develop feeding response. Subject 31 successfully bonded with host. None of it made sense, but one word kept showing up: vampire. Not like the movie kind, but something worse, something real. The doctor's notes talked about making people who could somehow take energy from others, like stealing their life force. It sounded crazy, but those screams I heard, they were coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. I followed the pipes down another hallway. The walls here were different. Thick metal doors with tiny windows lined both sides. Through one of them I saw movement. When I looked closer, I wished I hadn't. A person was strapped to a bed, but they didn't look quite human anymore. Their skin was pale gray, and dark veins crept across their face like spider webs. Suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. Before I could turn around, something hard hit the back of my head. As everything went dark, I saw a man in a white coat standing over me. He looked like any normal doctor, except for his eyes. They were completely black, like empty holes. "Another test subject," he said calmly. "How fortunate." I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. The last thing I remember before passing out was being dragged toward one of those metal doors, and thinking about how no one knew I was here. I woke up with a splitting headache in one of those metal rooms. They'd taken my coat, shoes, and flashlight, but somehow missed the small radio clipped to my belt under my shirt. I was strapped down to a bed, but the restraints were old and a bit loose. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw I wasn't alone. There was another bed across the room with someone on it, a young homeless man I recognized from town. He'd usually hang out near the coffee shop, always polite, asking for spare change. But now, he looked different. His skin was nearly white, and his eyes had that same blackness I'd seen in the doctor's. "They're going to do it to you too," he whispered. His voice sounded dry, like rustling paper. "The doctor, he hooks us up to these machines. Says he's making us better, stronger. But really, he's turning us into monsters." He told me everything while I worked on loosening my restraints. The doctor had been a researcher at the hospital before it closed. He believed he could make people stronger by teaching them to absorb energy from others, not just physical energy, but what he called life force. The experiments worked, sort of. The test subjects could drain energy from people just by being near them, but it changed them, made them hungry all the time, made them less human. "How many others are there?" I asked, finally getting one hand free. 12 of us now," he said, "in the feeding chambers downstairs. That's where they keep the new people they bring in, the ones we have to feed on. I don't want to, but the hunger, it hurts so much." Just then I heard footsteps in the hallway. The doctor was back, and he wasn't alone. I quickly put my hand back under the restraint, pretending to still be tied down. The door opened, and the doctor walked in with 2 men in white coats. "Ah, Agent Morgan," the doctor smiled. His black eyes seemed to suck in the light. "I hope you're comfortable. You'll be helping us make history. We've never had a government agent as a test subject before." He walked over to a large machine in the corner and started turning it on. It hummed like a giant battery, and tubes filled with dark liquid began to pulse. "Your body will resist at first," he said, filling a syringe with something black. "They all do. But soon you'll understand. We're the next step in human evolution. We're what people were always meant to become." I knew I had to act fast. The radio on my belt could maybe call for help, but I needed a distraction. Looking around the room, I noticed something that might save my life. The power cables for his machine ran right through a puddle of water on the floor. As the doctor came closer with the syringe, I knew it was now or never. With one quick move, I ripped my other hand free and grabbed the radio from my belt. The doctor jumped back, surprised. "Stay where you are," I said, backing toward the corner. "I've called for backup. They're already on their way." I was bluffing. I hadn't called anyone yet, but he didn't know that. The doctor just laughed. "No one will find us down here. The basement walls are too thick for radio signals." He nodded to his assistants. "Hold him." But as they came toward me, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my radio as hard as I could into the puddle near the power cables. Sparks flew everywhere. The machine made a horrible screeching noise, and all the lights started flickering. "No," the doctor screamed. "The containment field." Alarms started blaring. Through the small window in our door, I could see other doors in the hallway starting to open. The power surge had unlocked everything. "The subjects," one assistant yelled. "They're getting out." The doctor ran from the room, dropping the syringe. I grabbed it. It might be evidence if I made it out. The homeless man on the other bed looked at me with scared eyes. "You have to shut down the power completely," he said weakly. "It's the only way to stop us. When the hunger comes, we can't control it, and it's getting stronger. Please, end this." I could hear chaos in the hallway, people running, screaming. The doctor was shouting orders. I knew what I had to do. Running out, I pushed past the scared assistants and followed the power cables. They led to a bigger room filled with humming machines, the main power station. This was what kept everything running, kept the vampires alive. Behind me, I heard the doctor. "Don't do it, Agent Morgan. You'll kill them all." "They're already dead," I said, remembering the homeless man's words. "You killed them when you turned them into these things." I found the main power switch. It was big, like something from an old monster movie. As I grabbed it, I felt hands on my shoulders, cold hands. The test subjects had found me. Their black eyes were hungry, desperate. The doctor was right behind them. "Think about what you're doing," he said. "We could make humanity stronger. No more weakness, no more death." "No," I said, "just monsters." I pulled the switch. The power station exploded in a shower of sparks. Everything went pitch black, and the screaming. I'll never forget those screams. The cold hands let go of me as bodies fell around me in the dark. I could hear the doctor yelling, then suddenly stopping. I stumbled through the darkness, feeling my way along the wall. My phone was gone, but I still had my lighter. Its tiny flame showed me the way out. As I passed the rooms with the metal doors, everything was quiet now. Too quiet. It took me almost an hour to find my way back upstairs. When I finally pushed open the front door, the morning sun nearly blinded me. Police cars and ambulances filled the parking lot. Someone must have seen the lights go out and called 911. The official report sounds crazy, even now. They found 13 bodies in the basement, the doctor and his 12 test subjects. The doctor's notes explained everything: his experiments, the missing people, how he found a way to make people drain energy from others. Some of the higher-ups wanted to keep testing his research, but I made sure all of it was destroyed. Sometimes I drive past that old hospital. They're tearing it down next month, finally. But late at night, I still think about that homeless man and how human he sounded at the end. I think about the doctor's black eyes and his talk about making humanity stronger. The hardest part? Knowing I had to kill those 12 people to stop something worse from happening. They were victims too, but that hunger in them, it was spreading, growing. If it had gotten out of that basement, into the city. I still work for HHS, still check on hospitals. But now I look closer, check every basement, every closed door. Because if I learned one thing from that asylum, it's that the scariest monsters aren't the ones in movies. They're the ones in white coats who think they're doing the right thing. My sister Sarah asked me once why I looked so tired these days. I just told her some cases are harder than others. She smiled and hugged me, not knowing how close I'd come to becoming one of those things in the basement. Not knowing that some nights I still dream about those black eyes staring at me in the dark. The official files are sealed now. As far as the world knows, there was just a fire in an old, empty building. But I know the truth, and I keep checking hospitals, looking for signs. Because, somewhere out there, another doctor might be reading those old files, getting ideas, and I'll be ready if they do. Some secrets should stay buried. This one sleeps in the rubble of that old asylum. At least I hope it does. My name is Mark Anderson, and I never thought I'd witness something so terrifying that it would keep me awake even years later. Back in 1998, I was working as an EPA agent in Michigan, checking lakes and rivers to make sure they were safe for people to use. It wasn't the most exciting job, mostly taking water samples and writing reports, but I liked helping keep communities safe. It all started on a chilly September morning when I got a strange call from a small town called Pine Lake. The locals were complaining about their water turning a weird greenish-black color, and some people were getting sick after swimming in it. I remember thinking it was probably just another case of factory waste or algae, the usual stuff we deal with. Boy, was I wrong. When I first drove into Pine Lake, something felt off. The town seemed normal enough. Small houses dotted around a beautiful lake, kids riding their bikes, and people walking their dogs. But there was this heavy feeling in the air, like right before a big storm hits. The lake itself was gorgeous, with an old mansion sitting right on its shore. That mansion, I later learned, would be at the center of everything. I parked my car near the lake and took out my testing kit. The water did look strange darker than it should be, with an oily sheen on top that definitely wasn't normal. As I knelt down to take a sample, I heard someone behind me. "I wouldn't touch that water if I were you." I turned around to see an old man standing there, his eyes filled with worry. He was shaking his head slowly, and what he told me next would be the beginning of the scariest investigation of my life. The old man's hands were trembling as he sat down on a nearby bench. "This lake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it's changing people." He told me how his grandson had gone swimming last week and came out different, complaining about his neck hurting and having trouble breathing normal air. I tried to stay professional, but something in his voice made my skin crawl. "Different how?" I asked, putting away my testing equipment. He started spending all his time in the bathtub, keeping his head underwater. His neck." The old man paused, swallowing hard. "We found these slits forming on his neck, like fish gills. Normally, I'd think someone was playing a prank, but there was real fear in his eyes. Just then, my phone buzzed. 3 more reports of people getting sick after swimming in the lake, all with the same symptoms: neck pain, trouble breathing, and a desperate need to be in water. I decided to check out the mansion first. It stood there like a giant shadow against the gray sky, its windows dark and uninviting. As I walked up the cracking pathway, I noticed something odd. All the plants in the garden were dead, but they weren't dried out. They were wet, like they'd been drowning. The family living there, the Winters, weren't what I expected. Mrs. Winters opened the door, wearing a turtleneck sweater despite the warm weather. Her skin looked damp. Behind her, I could hear splashing sounds coming from inside the house. "We've been expecting someone like you," she said, her voice raspy. "Please come in. There's something you need to see." I've investigated hundreds of water pollution cases, but as I stepped into that house, my gut was screaming at me to turn around and run. Maybe I should have listened. Inside the mansion, puddles of water dotted the floor, and the air felt as thick as soup. Mrs. Winters led me to their living room, but it wasn't really a living room anymore. They had turned it into something like a makeshift pool, with kiddie pools and large water containers everywhere. In one of them, I saw their youngest daughter, just floating there, staring at me with wide, glassy eyes. "Emily, honey, come say hello," Mrs. Winters called out. The little girl lifted her head from the water, and I had to stop myself from gasping. On both sides of her neck were these soft, moving flaps, just like fish gills. "It started 2 weeks ago," Mr. Winters said, appearing from another room. His clothes were soaking wet. "After we found some old books in the basement about Sarah Conway." He showed me a dusty journal, its pages wavy from water damage. "Sarah Conway," he explained, "was a woman who lived in the mansion back in 1932. The townspeople had accused her of being a witch and drowned her in the lake. As she died, she cursed the lake and everyone who lived near it." "I know how this sounds," Mrs. Winters said, wiping water from her face. "We wouldn't believe it either, but..." She pulled down her turtleneck, revealing gills just like her daughter's. "It's happening to all of us. First the children, then me, now my husband." Just then their teenage son stumbled in, coughing hard. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't breathe the air anymore." His father quickly helped him into one of the pools, and the boy's face relaxed as soon as he was underwater. I stood there, my mind racing. This wasn't pollution. This was something else, something I wasn't trained for, and it was spreading through the town. That's when I heard screams coming from outside. I ran outside, with Mr. Winters right behind me. Down by the lake, a crowd had gathered. A woman was pointing at something in the water, screaming. At first, I thought someone was drowning, but then I saw them. People swimming in the lake, but they weren't exactly people anymore. Their skin had turned a pale bluish gray, their eyes were huge and dark, and their necks, those gills were moving in and out like they were breathing underwater. They didn't even try to come up for air. Some of them were our missing townspeople who had disappeared over the past week. "Mark," someone called out. It was the old man from earlier running toward me. "My grandson. He just jumped in." I couldn't stop him. I looked back at the lake. More people were gathering at the shore, all of them scratching their necks. Some had wet hair and damp clothes like they'd just been swimming. Others were starting to cough and gasp, just like the winter's sun. "It's spreading faster," Mr. Winters whispered. "The curse. It's getting stronger." I took out my phone and called for backup. But what could I tell them? That people were turning into fish people? That a witch's curse was real? They'd think I was crazy, but I had to do something. That's when I noticed something even scarier. The transformed people in the lake were starting to swim closer to the shore. Their webbed hands reached out toward their family members on the beach. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to pull them in, like they wanted everyone to join them. And the worst part? Some people were letting them. "We need to clear the beach," I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by more screams. A little boy had just pushed past his mother and jumped into the dark water. I rushed back to the mansion with the Winters family. My mind was racing. I needed to find a way to stop this before the whole town turned. Back in the flooded living room, I started reading through Sarah Conway's old journal more carefully. That's when I spotted something important, a small note scribbled in the margin about how the curse worked. "The lake is her grave," I said out loud, "and it's also her power source. The more people transformed, the stronger her curse became." It was like a chain reaction that wouldn't stop until everyone in town was changed. Mrs. Winters looked up from the pool where she was comforting her children. "Can't we just leave town?" she asked, her gills fluttering as she spoke. I shook my head. "The journal says once the change starts, you can't survive more than a few hours away from the lake water, and now half the town is affected." That's when I remembered something from my EPA training about how to clean lakes when they get too polluted. Sometimes you have to add certain chemicals to kill harmful things in the water. But this wasn't just about cleaning the water. This was about breaking a curse. Would the same chemicals work on something supernatural? "Mr. Winters," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "your family, you were the first to change. The curse started here, in this house. According to the journal, Sarah Conway's spirit is tied to this place, to your family." His eyes widened with understanding. "You're saying, I think I know how to stop this," I said, "but it's going to take a sacrifice. A big one. And I can't make this decision for you." The whole family looked at each other, water dripping from their faces. They knew what I was asking, and they knew what would happen if we didn't act fast. The plan was heartbreaking but simple. I would add special chemicals to the lake, the kind we use to clean really dirty water. But timing was everything. The Winters family would have to stay in the lake while I did it. They were the key, since they were the first to change. Their sacrifice would break the curse. "We understand," Mr. Winters said, holding his wife's hand. Their 3 kids huddled close to them. Even little Emily seemed to know how serious this was. I ran to my car and grabbed my emergency lake treatment kit. By now, the sun was setting, making the lake look black as ink. More townspeople had transformed. I could see their shapes moving under the water, getting closer to shore. "You'll have to swim out to the deepest part," I told the Winters. "That's where Sarah Conway drowned. That's where the curse is strongest." Mrs. Winters hugged each of her children. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're doing this to save everyone else." They walked into the water together, holding hands. The other transformed people tried to swim toward them, but somehow they kept their distance, like they could sense what was about to happen. My hands were shaking as I started adding the chemicals to the lake. The water began to bubble and turn a strange color. I heard splashing and crying from the lake. The transformed townspeople started thrashing around in the water. Then I saw the Winters family in the middle of the lake. They raised their hands above the water like they were reaching for the sky. There was a bright flash, like lightning hitting the water, and then silence. The water turned clear again, like someone had flicked a switch. One by one, the transformed people started swimming back to shore. As they came out of the water, I could see their gills disappearing. like they were healing right before my eyes. Parents hugged their children, crying with relief as they could breathe normal air again. But the Winters family never came back up. The next morning, I stood at the lake's edge. The water was blue and peaceful, like nothing had ever happened. The old mansion seemed different too, less scary, A small crowd gathered behind me, everyone quiet, remembering what the Winters family did for them. The old man who'd first warned me put his hand on my shoulder. His grandson was back to normal, standing next to him. "They saved us all," he said softly. I wrote my official EPA report about Pine Lake, but I left out most of what really happened. Who would believe it anyway? I said there was a chemical spill that we managed to clean up. Simple, normal, believable. But sometimes on quiet nights, people say they see 5 shapes swimming in the deep part of the lake. They say if you look closely, you can see them holding hands, dancing in the moonlight. They're not trapped or cursed anymore. They're protecting the lake, making sure nothing like this ever happens again. I still drive by Pine Lake sometimes. The water is clean and clear, and kids swim there in the summer. Most people have forgotten what happened, or they think it was just a bad dream. But I know the truth, and every time I pass by, I whisper a quiet thank you to the Winters family, the real heroes of Pine Lake. That was 25 years ago, but I've never taken another water pollution case. Some things change you forever, and sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones whose stories are never really told.